Hello, I am Jack Brewer with Expanding Frontiers Research, and welcome to the Wayward Sons Book Group, where we read and discuss my nonfiction book, Wayward Sons, NICAP, and the IC. In this episode, we will be looking at the activities of Colonel Joseph Bryan III. He was a mysterious and interesting character in the UFO saga. He was a staple of the NICAP Board of Governors. He was a CIA asset. Colonel Bryan was a specialist in psychological warfare, a career newspaperman, and a talented and widely read writer. A curious combination of career choices and activities indeed. I am joined tonight by Brian and Jeff Knox. We are sent our regards from Tanner Boyle, who is attending the Pittsburgh UFO Club meeting tonight. He recently spoke there and wanted to offer his support ongoing and said to give you guys his regards. Allison and Sharon Brown also let me know that they might have some challenges attending tonight. So it looks like we are going to have to shoulder the reading tonight, gentlemen. So, are there any goings on? Anything since last week that either of you would like to share about?
I just thought I'd mention it's the anniversary of Kenneth Arnold's UFO sighting 79 years ago on June 24th, 1947 at 1 minute before 3 o'clock p.m. He saw 9 saucers or 9 discs or, depending on how you want it, saucer-like objects flying around Mount Rainier. So it's sort of World UFO Day. World UFO Day has been hijacked by the July 2nd folks. There's an organization called World UFO Day who's decided that World UFO Day is now on July 2nd, but I believe today is more accurate since today is what kicked off the modern era of ufology.
I see. And by the time folks are watching this on YouTube, they will have already been aware that the predicted group UFO abduction at a World Cup match, I'm assuming, didn't happen. Did you guys hear about that?
Yep. I saw her video, but it never happened, unfortunately. We didn't get catastrophic disclosure like we were all hoping for.
Next year. It'll happen next year.
Right. Any news with you, Brian, or anything of note that you'd like to discuss?
After joining these sessions and reading, and I see history repeating in current events. You have folks who make claims without really good evidence or fuzzy evidence or whatever you want to say. And then, of course, you look into them and they are hosted by a vitamin company and a for-profit company, and they're seen as a media company. So I'm referring to recent psionic folks claiming they've landed a craft and an alien was seen. And if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that the CEO of the company owns a vitamin company. The mission statement of the company itself is to create media, and everyone involved in it is there for sensationalism. So if, I'm not a predictions guy, but if I did, I would say that there's going to be some kind of supplement or mushroom coffee that comes along with your psionics. So a little bit of a cynical view, but it reminded me instantly of the gentleman from your book, I forget the name, who was selling tickets to Venus. We're a little more enterprising, a little more sophisticated these days, but honestly, I don't see the difference. So on top of the disclosure there and disclosure that we saw online, time and time again, we come right back to what we talk about here.
Very good points. And there's such a thin line there, that so much gray area. You remind me of a story I came across years ago of a company that I don't remember what they were promoting, but they flew some type of craft, you can put them together, balloon, drone, whatever, that look like what people would think a saucer or alien spacecraft should look like, past a minor league baseball game while, there were lots of people in the stands. And this was a promotion for their product. And then, they had to issue an apology, and maybe this wasn't, the best idea in the world, yada, yada. But it obviously got the eyes and the print and the attention that they were seeking. And I'm keeping a list of things as we go through these discussions where more research could be a good idea. Welcome, Sharon. And that's one of them, the topic of UFOs or paranormal phenomena, not just as a hoax, but as a completely legal promotional tool, although the ethics or the professionalism might be questioned of how it's done. It comes to mind too that what plays into that is there are professional crop circle, or there were makers that would do product endorsements that would pay to have their logo or whatnot put in the field. That seems less harmful to me than what seems like more deceptive advertising, like you're describing, Brian. But it does all tie in. And it's exactly what we talk about regularly here, that why wouldn't the intelligence community want in on some of that action and press and things that give stories legs? Sure.
There's Polymarket's tagline. Well, first of all, they show aliens as in their ads, and they say their tagline is question everything. They're basically saying the quiet part out loud is like, let's go after our target market, which is the conspiratorial folks. Let's take truth, let's twist it. And then, by the way, if you want to put a bet on it, you could make some money. So it's like, now we're talking gambling, and we're talking very gray, like you said. So yes, if you want to have a supplement company, that's fine. But if you're going to go speak in front of people and demonstrate that you've made contact and that this event happened, you might want to disclose the fact that you are a media company and for profit. I think there's some things that should go along with it, and that your just average person's not going to see or put together.
Excellent point. Just today on Blue Sky, Jeff shared an old letter from Colonel Bryan that we'll be discussing tonight. And Colonel Bryan, am I correct, Jeff, tried to get some insurance from Lloyd's of London about disclosure statements.
Yeah, he had a couple of different criteria like that. The saucers are real. The next level up was that we made contact with them or something, and there's some other level. And then he gave three potential dates, some years apart. And Lloyd's of London essentially responded back that yeah, we don't really do policies of this type. He was a little too early for Polymarket or Kalshi. Otherwise, he would have been set, and he could have had this done like that.
Yeah, I mean, he's a CIA psychological warfare specialist. he stands to be involved in creating the statements that he's wanting insurance on. What if these statements come out, you know? Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me. Welcome, Sharon. Good to see you.
Hi. Have you started recording?
We have. Is that okay?
Sure. Here, I'll give you a look. Look, I'll show you the ocean.
Oh my gosh.
I should have showed you the sound side. That's where the pretty sunset was.
North Carolina Outer Banks?
No, this is North Carolina, Topsail Island, which is south of the Outer Banks, which is closer to where I live.
I see. That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing it.
Of course.
Before we dive into the chapter, I wanted to read you guys a bio I came across of Joseph Bryan. I do not necessarily agree with this entire statement, but I did want to enter it into the record, so to speak, for your consideration of it and the audience consideration, that this is on the current NICAP website. The bio for Colonel Joseph Bryan reads: at NICAP, Donald Kehoe was visited by a man identifying himself as Colonel Joseph Bryan III, U.S. Air Force. Bryan was apparently formerly U.S. Air Force, but what he did not reveal was that he operated as CIA. More than that, and amazingly, he was one of the CIA's highest psychological warfare experts. Later UFO historians have been made uncomfortable by this fact, since Bryan became a member of the NICAP Board of Governors. Was this a Trojan horse inserted into the Air Force's main civilian irritant? Nothing would have made more sense, but surprisingly, there is no evidence of meddling at all. Richard Hall, NICAP's assistant director, knew Bryan and really knew how NICAP operated and made decisions. He said that Bryan was strictly hands-off in these matters. Added to that, Bryan was willing to go public with an extremely positive statement about the likelihood extraterrestrial nature of the devices. And what I find most interesting about that is the implication that if Bryan made a statement endorsing extraterrestrial visitation, that couldn't have been meddling, that he wasn't meddling if he was pro extraterrestrial hypothesis. I find that telling. I find it interesting. Comments welcome.
I was just going to say, I mean, that wasn't the only time that there was someone popping over and proclaiming allegiance, right? Saying what needs to be said. That's conjecture, but you know, was it Hillenkoetter, I think, that said some things that pleased Kehoe, and he's like, this guy's fine with me as long as he's, fine with that. And I believe yeah, forgive me, Richard Hall also said, I just kind of left those guys alone and did my thing. So there's this kind of this complacency. As long as you didn't make trouble, nobody really looked into what you were doing. A little bit of conjecture there, but interesting that you do a pledge of allegiance, and Kehoe, who's very strong-willed and vocal, is cool with you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to practice what I preach and try to be objective here, maybe Colonel Bryan was a UFO believer. Maybe he honestly thought that flying saucers are occupied by extraterrestrial visitors. There's no rule that says you can't be a CIA warfare specialist and an author that writes CIA propaganda for all practical purposes and is a liaison with magazines, as we'll see in the coming pages. There's no rule that says that can all be true and you believe in flying saucers. I just think it's a different issue that the NICAP collectively and the UFO community collectively tend to think an intelligence officer is a good guy if he is pro UFO. And that doesn't seem to have changed a lot over the decades either. We still see a lot of that today, too. And do we have a volunteer to start reading chapter 11 for us, Colonel Bryan?
I'll start. It's got my name on it.
Thank you.
Chapter 11, Colonel Bryan. Joseph Bryan III, from 1904 to 1993, had the distinction of serving in 3 different branches of the service: the Army Lieutenant, Navy Lieutenant Commander, and Air Force Lieutenant Colonel. Bryan reportedly worked for the CIA from the late 40s until 1953. His apparent background in intelligence and expertise in psychological warfare was not widely known during his years as a staple of NICAP. Bryan was born into an influent Virginia family. He went to Episcopal High School in Alexandria before attending Princeton University, where in 1927 he obtained an A.B. degree. Bryan had rather extensive and significant writing career. The image below is from 1947 FBI memo, subject Joseph Bryan III, which is part of an FBI file compiled by Bryan and obtained through the FOIA. For a bit of clarification on the Whitney family reference, the memo went to assert his mother-in-law is a Whitney, and as a result of his marriage, he is independently wealthy. In 1942, Bryan was commissioned a lieutenant in the Navy, and his service included assignment to the Southwest Pacific. In 1944, as a lieutenant commander, he reported for duty to the Office of Public Relations in Washington. An online search conducted at CIA Reading Room using the term Office of Public Relations returned documents suggesting, as one might expect, the office served propaganda and intelligence efforts. Interestingly, Navy brass, future NICAP board member, and inaugural CIA director Roscoe Hillenkoetter has a few appearances among the documents. A 1948 letter written to Hillenkoetter from Army Brigadier General E.J. McGraw is among the documents that carry implications for the significance of the Office of Public Relations. The general offered an apology in his letter for declining an invitation to meet Hillenkoetter following the latter's public speaking engagement. McGraw indicated he had to promptly leave the event because his presence was required elsewhere. He was unable to stay and make the CIA director's acquaintance. McGraw advised Hillenkoetter, because Admiral F. Hickey, Deputy Director, Office of Public Relations, Department of the Navy, was arriving at Carlisle Barracks at 12:15 p.m. The CIA online reading room has a few documents that contain references to both Hillenkoetter and the Navy Office of Public Relations. Additional search returns on the agency website include a 1947 National Security Council report referencing the office. The report addresses steps required to strengthen and coordinate all foreign information measures of the U.S. government in furtherance of the attainment of U.S. national objectives. It seems an entirely reasonable assumption Bryan's 1944 involvement in the Office of Public Relations helped facilitate his path to the CIA and 1948 Office of the Policy Coordination. The previously referenced 1947 FBI memo indicates the Richmond field office reported that after the death of Bryan's father, He inherited his father's stock in Richmond Newspapers, Inc. Bryan was then a small stockholder in the newspaper company, apparently owned by his uncle. The New York Times reported Bryan held editorial positions with Time Magazine, The New Yorker, and Town and Country, and was associate editor at the Saturday Evening Post from 1937 to 1940. He then became a freelance writer. His continued interactions with media outlets, particularly newspapers executives, were destined to become significant to his career in intelligence, as we shall see. The 1947 FBI interest in Bryan was because he was under consideration by the Saturday Evening Post for an assignment to write a series of articles profiling the FBI. FBI Director Hoover and his agents, of course, who wanted to know about the author and assess the likely tone of the series. Bryan was not the first writer considered by the Post for the project, and the Bureau previously expressed dissatisfaction with the candidates. It was important that the FBI identify its ability to influence the content of the articles and framing of the Bureau. In 1947, FBI memo stated Bryan had been characterized as being born with a silver spoon in his mouth and developing an unrealistic personal interpretation of the world. Bryan, the memo suggested, might be unaware of the social and economic conditions of the time due to his understandings being limited to Cafe Society of New York. He was described as an individual who enjoyed and appreciated a good time. He was also described to the Bureau by multiple professional journalists as an excellent writer. The Bureau spoke with various acquaintances of Bryan, including a general manager at the Richmond newspaper. The man suggested Bryan tended to write about observations he could see on the surface rather than dig into operations of an organization. While the general manager expressed the opinion, Bryan would write critically if he felt a situation warranted. He added Bryan was more inclined to focus on the glorious rather than the critical side of any operation. He indicated Bryan was extremely ethical and could maintain confidences. Bryan was described as a physically very tall and fashionable dresser who liked to be the center of attention in New York society. He was said to be extremely conservative, and his loyalty to the United States was unquestioned. The memo added, it was pointed out that the best way to handle Bryan is to outline exactly what information he should publish and have a clear understanding with him as to the information he could not publish. The FBI talked to Jack Patterson, described as formerly in the Public Relations Office of the department, a reference I interpreted to mean the Justice Department, which includes the FBI. Patterson was employed with the State Department at the time, and the FBI memo was composed in 1947 and was referred to knowing Bryan personally. He described Bryan as a very witty and echoed previous comments indicating Bryan could be trusted to maintain confidences. Patterson thought that the thing to do with Bryan was to be very factual and lay the cards on the table. A 1947 FBI memo authored by Assistant Director L.B. Nichols documented Bryan visited Bureau headquarters the week of October 13, 1947. Nichols greeted Bryan and provided a rather extensive tour. They discussed the potential series of articles, and the memo indicates Nichols was optimistic about Bryan. Hoover shared the optimism, going as far as to highlight conditions put forth by Bryan for writing the articles. He was so fond of Bryan's suggested conditions, he noted that they should be kept in mind for future dealings with writers. Bryan shared some ground rules he used for writing about Navy Admiral William Halsey, resulting in a book considered by some to have been the best work, as noted in a previous memo. Bryan suggested to Nichols, and Hoover highlighted that he would write nothing except that which was true, that he would not write anything which would cast a reflection on the naval service, that he would not put anything into direct quote which Halsey did not specifically authorize. It is not difficult to understand why Hoover would appreciate the gist of the strategy. When Bryan and Nichols met with Hoover, Nichols took the opportunity to emphasize Bryan committed to publish only what was true, and stated he would let them see the material. The meeting apparently went well for the Bureau, and Nichols described it as very much worthwhile. An observation Nichols noted and described as rather interesting involved Bryan reportedly telling a friend he would meet them at 5 p.m., yet appearing unconcerned as the appointment time passed. Nichols wrote the late afternoon meeting with Director Hoover went on for some 2 hours, lasting until about 6:15 p.m., even though Nichols reminded Bryan of his 5 p.m. commitment. Even though I had to remind him of the 5 o'clock appointment, Nichols noted, he had lost track completely of the time. Nichols further wrote in the memo a question Bryan posed after meeting Hoover, and the answer he was ostensibly given. Nichols apparently documented the situation in the event it should come up again, and any agents with access to the memo would be aware of it. During his conversation with Hoover, Bryan mentioned he was still a naval officer, to which Hoover replied, "I know." Bryan asked Nichols how Hoover knew. Nichols constructed a story in response in which he claimed he was asked a mutual acquaintance in Richmond about Bryan after learning Bryan might be writing about the FBI. The acquaintance, Nichols told Bryan, subsequently sent a newspaper clipping with an extensive bio on Bryan. The director undoubtedly saw the clippings, Nichols added. One might suspect a number of such games were represented in comments exchanged between Bryan, Hoover, and Nichols during Bryan's visit to the Bureau. Nichols included the following passage in his memo. I further told Bryan if he wished he would be glad to give him an office and a typewriter, and he could write here at the Bureau, and if questions arose, he could put them to us, and if the questions necessitated research, we could compile the information at the time. This seemed to please Bryan, and he stated that he would be very glad to take advantage of this offer. It frankly is my idea that the closer we kept Bryan to the Bureau, the most voluminous information we can furnish him, the less he will be seeking it from bootleg sources. Hoover noted at the end of the Nichols memo, he felt Bryan was sincere. He concurred the Bureau should help him all it could, but it was yet to be seen whether Bryan could make the Saturday Evening Post see Hoover and his agents in the right light. Nichols later documented in November 1947 FBI memo a telephone conversation he initiated with Bryan, who stated there was no rush on the FBI series. FBI added he was just about to write Nichols to inform him another matter arose that the Saturday Evening Post insisted he handle immediately. However, noted it looked like the series was fading. Bryan would later indicate he scrapped the project entirely. In a February 1948 letter to Assistant Director Nichols, Bryan suggested his workload would not allow him to author the series of articles on the FBI. He informed the Bureau he would not be writing about it. I think there's a strong likelihood this chain of events reflects Bryan's recruitment into the Office of Policy Coordination, which you will recall was launched in 1948. You will also recall E. Howard Hunt asserted he worked for Bryan in the OPC as a member of the Political and Psychological Warfare staff. The OPC, its personnel, and its merge with the Office of Special Operations in 1952, as previously explored, tied into DCI Smith's interest in the UFO topic as a psychological warfare tool. The celebrated PBSUC CESS CIA operation in Guatemala. The 1954 CIA cable to assist in Guatemala suggested consideration to be given to fabricating a flying saucer story as a public distraction in related events.
Thank you, Bryan. I appreciate you reading. Yeah, we explore there basically just what was in Bryan's FBI file. And he was supposedly going to write a story for the Saturday Evening Post. A number of authors had been floated about the story. Hoover didn't like any of them. They clearly had some influence with the Post and with how this story was going to be written. And that, I think, is how Bryan came about to be the one that was being considered to write the story. But I felt like there's a lot of stuff to be read between the lines there, too. That Bryan wondered how the director knew he was still a Navy officer. And then Nichols misrepresented, concocted an explanation about that to apparently, one might think, not tip their hand to Bryan that they know as much about him as they do, which I'm suspecting means his affiliation with the CIA and the different propaganda offices he was involved with and or negotiating employment with. And I when I first was reading this, I was never really sure if Bryan was being somewhat sarcastic to the Bureau, that he didn't respect what they were doing, or if he like he was polite and professional but completely wasted their time. And it's hard to tell. It just feels like there's some under the table jabs going back and forth to some extent. Do you guys kind of get that impression, or is it more like Bryan's just kind of scattered and he's probably got the CIA recruiting him to come to work and he doesn't have time to do a FBI story with the Saturday Evening Post, possibly?
Yeah, I mean, this was during his time working for the CIA, so could have just got busy, but it does seem like they were happy to kind of poke fun at Bryan, call him born a silver spoon, his kind of view of the world isn't really realistic, but seemed fine as long because he was very loyal and patriotic to the United States. So the fact that they think he's kind of out there is okay, but because he's loyal, so they're cool with it. But then he just kind of backs out of it. Yeah, I don't know. Could be either way.
And he'd know that, like he'd know if he were around some FBI guys that their self-image is tough and, crusaders against crime. He'd know that they think he's a Princeton educated, entitled guy that and maybe he really didn't have a good handle on how the other half lives. Maybe they're right about that. But I'm just saying, the same way that the rebels that resent the wealthy know how the wealthy, or presume they know how the wealthy look down on them, I think the same applies to some extent, that the wealthy have a pretty good idea how they're being viewed by the guys that have a 9-to-5 job somewhere, and that Bryan arguably has some reason to resent that like, look, dudes, I'm an officer in 3 different branches of the service. What do you want out of me? How would I prove that I'm tough enough or loyal enough? And I don't know. I just felt like those were some dynamics going on there. And maybe he is completely entitled, maybe he's basically made an officer just for signing up. I don't know. More research required to know.
He did spend much of 1945 on board the aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown, which led to a book he later wrote in 1954 called The Aircraft Carrier, which is largely a recollection of his time spending most of a year on board aircraft carrier. So, he like you say, he served in 3 different branches, like he had commissions in 3 different branches of the military. He actually spent a good part of the year on a boat, like he wasn't just on land, in an office the whole time. So he he may have been born, wealthy with a silver spoon, but he did have some life experience out there.
Yeah, I would argue more than some of the people criticizing him. I mean, he was well traveled. He became more well traveled. And as we're going to see, one of his associates, Pinky Thompson, that was born into privilege, seemed to almost have some survivor guilt about that. That, like, he's going to the CIA saying, "What can I do? How can I help?" Yeah, that we're going to get to. Would you like to continue reading, Jeff?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Let's consider how a series of FOIA requests on Joseph Bryan III progressed. In 2019, I submitted requests to the CIA and FBI for records pertaining to Bryan. In 2020 response, the CIA denied my FOIA request and would neither confirm nor deny the existence or non-existence of any such records, as the information itself is properly classified. The Glomar response. The agency did acknowledge its website hosts 2 documents related to Bryan. One is a file containing a 1966 NICAP-related newspaper article. The other is a 1951 CIA calendar with a brief reference to an October 25 telephone call with Bryan. The call quite possibly was conducted with DCI Smith, given the date and the fact that the file is part of a Smith special collection. Telephone conversations with Mr. Joseph Bryan, page 138 of the document reads, quote, advising him that Mr. George Kennan would be unable to comment on the book Come Stalin, end quote. The FBI promptly responded by providing a 37-page PDF containing material as linked and described above. The file contains 7 more letters and memos, which will be explored in the forthcoming pages. The Bureau advised of the existence of 2 additional potentially responsive files and indicated more potentially responsive files were destroyed. The 2 files were identified as 62-HQ-116607 and 100-HQ-93216. The FBI suggested both were in the care of NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. NARA responded to my resulting FOIA request. It was not in possession of 62-HQ-116607 and stated the file remained in FBI custody. A subsequent series of follow-up correspondence with FBI, including a FOIA appeal, did not produce the file. The Bureau ultimately implied it was destroyed. NARA indicated the second of the 2 files, 100-HQ-93216, was indeed in its possession and was believed to contain material pertaining to Joseph Bryan III. The administration further stated the file consisted of some 8,500 pages and would have to be processed for release pursuant to the FOIA. Subsequent correspondence with NARA revealed only 2 of the pages referred directly to Bryan. NARA processed and provided the 2 pages as requested, which we will explore a bit later. Other aspects of the large file would prove to be of interest as well. Further research revealed the file 100-HQ-93216 was previously released in part to John Greenwald of the Black Vault. In 2005, he received about 360 of the 8,500 pages. Its primary subject was bacteriological warfare, or more specifically, FBI investigation of potential threats of bacteriological warfare and related issues. In 2019, I published a blog post related to the circumstances. The post included a link to the PDF of the approximately 360 pages previously obtained by Greenwald. I was soon contacted by microbiologist Dr. Tyler Cochon, who informed me he had been reading the file and discovered an intriguing document within it. He had directed my attention to pages 207 to 212 of the PDF, which contained a memo dated May 31st, 1949, subject, Bacteriological Warfare. The 6-page memo is written from FBI Assistant Director Ladd to Director Hoover and referenced an advisory committee to the Secretary of Defense. The Bureau was repeatedly encouraged to send a representative to meetings of the committee, which explored matters relating to biological warfare. the Bureau had held fast it preferred a relationship with the advisory committee via liaison rather than direct participation. The memo summarized meeting minutes provided to the FBI from a then recent gathering of the group indicated representatives from academic institutions and the CIA were in attendance. Discussion topics included what were described as security precautions pertaining to a presumably human research subject, the project and the potential lack of adequate security precautions, it was suggested, might prove unsafe for public consumption, and that knowledge of the existence of such a project might bring forth ridicule. The memo continued. The committee expressed considerable interest in the various methods of isolation of the subconscious mind, which were discussed, particularly in the use of drugs as an aid to hypnotic techniques. The area of the memo following the above statement was redacted, as was the case with additional sections. I soon submitted a request to NARA for a mandatory declassification review of the memo. NARA complied, and in its response, released a substantial amount of previously redacted material. One of the more intriguing finds of the MDR was a revealed FBI documentation a CIA scientist asserted the advisory committee represented the first time the CIA sought to collaborate with American intelligence agencies and institutions about behavior modification research. The memo further documented the CIA sought support from the committee for vigorous exploration of such research. The scientist was Scientific Branch Chief Dr. Willard Mockley. From page 3 of the further declassified version of the memo, the MDR also revealed further information about committee attendees, which apparently met May 14, 1949, in the Park Avenue, New York apartment of Dr. Alfred L. Loomis. It is for such reasons I have come to believe FBI archives are a significant resource for researchers on topics typically not considered to pertain to the FBI. If something mattered, there's a really good chance J. Edgar Hoover had a man on it. In many instances, he had multiple field offices on it. FBI files stand to provide us with reports compiled by professional investigators on any number of issues and people, which apparently include activities and personnel related to operations Bluebird, Artichoke, and eventually MKUltra. FBI documents archived and reviewed by NARA may provide information on CIA projects typically withheld and redacted by the CIA. Similar may likely be the case on any number of topics investigated by the Bureau and subsequently framed from the perspective of its agents. You will recall the above memo was plucked out of about 360 previously released pages of a large, vastly unprocessed 8,500-page file, 100-HQ-93126. In early 2020, I requested through the FOIA that NARA release the file in its entirety. The process will take several years, and NARA indicated it will incrementally notify me of the progress. The estimated total cost of a reproduction of the complete processed file, such as a PDF, is $6,800. I'm considering options such as enrolling the help of journalists who have grounds for fees to be waived. Additional options include partnering with institutions which recognize the potential historical value of the file, or undertaking crowdsource fundraising. The first job is to get the file or sections therefore processed and available. Then we can work on the best ways to obtain and start combing through the material. That's the FOIA request.
Thanks, Jeff. Let me stop you there for just a second. I just want to comment on that process, that fees can't be waived from the National Archives. I suggested there that perhaps journalists could get them waived, but they can't. NARA doesn't accept fee waivers because they don't charge for processing records. The only charge is for the reproduction. So the good news is I could request an 8,500-page file to be processed, and theoretically it's free. That won't cost me anything. It might take 10, 15, 20 years, I don't know, for it to be completed. They're supposed to let me incrementally know. but it doesn't cost anything just to have a file processed. The cost is if you want paper copies or a PDF copy. Then it's currently about 80 cents per page for either PDF or paper. But it's free to schedule a time to go view it. Now, whether you can take photos yourself of the file or how you can do that, I don't know that much about that process, but I just did want to clarify it's free to have it processed. You just pay for a reproduction. So, from my point of view, I think we should just be requesting everything we come across be processed practically. I mean, why not? And then it will at least be available, hopefully, one day when someone does want to schedule an appointment to go see it, or request 200 pages of it or 300 pages or whatever the case may be. Thanks.
That still seems a little obscenely overpriced for a fee, particularly since I wouldn't be surprised if these days when they're processing the file, they're actually already digitizing it so they can look at it on their computers anyways. And so I have a feeling the work's probably already done at that point. So they ought to just give us the PDF. And since it's not costing them anything to print out documents, if you're just giving us a PDF, they should just give it to us for free. But
yeah, with NARA, I could kind of argue it either way, that like it seems pretty obvious that the same fee shouldn't apply to a digital reproduction as it does to paper. Like, how can that be the same price? Yet I could make an argument that it's labor intensive. A lot of work goes into it. A lot of work goes into processing it. And they're just saying they want their, $80 per 100 pages. Okay, but like the argument you're making there, I recently requested some records from a regional police department, and they told me that their state's Freedom of Information Act does not require them to make records that are not already existent. And while they told me there is a box of records that I'm requesting, they are not in digital form. And they are not required to digitize these records, and that I may visit in person, and it's, another state, 2,000 miles from where I am, and I may visit in person, and then I may pay fees for paper copies, and that's what their state Information Act requires of them. So that answer fulfills the request. And I thought, wow, I don't doubt that. I believe that's true. It's just extremely dysfunctional, skirts the spirit of the law to provide the records. They're basically saying there is not a fee or a circumstance that's going to get an employee of this department to go in there and make PDFs out of those records. And I almost wondered, like, okay, if I'll fly up there and I scan them and I give you one of the memory sticks, when people request it in the future, would you give it to them? I like even start thinking like that. Like, what is, like, if I'll just volunteer to be your FOIA guy, would it be okay if I'll copy the records and give them to people that request them? So, yeah, I mean, I can argue the fees, but like you're saying, there's a point that it can become pretty impractical. That the Freedom of Information law from one state to the next, the spirit of it is obviously not to have a box of records literally rotting while people that are requesting it are being told, you can come by and look at the box anytime you want, but we're not making copies of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems a little silly that, yeah, we can tell you we got some files, but no, we can't help you actually look at them. You want to come here and do it yourself, okay, but yeah, we can't help you any further with this. And I think
like, well, have you processed them? Like if you just give me this stack of paper, is it going to already have redactions on it? Like if they're original, how could it? You know, like,
yeah.
What are we even talking? Like it was a pretty perplexing exchange.
I think this is also where I think it'd be a good idea to like kind of crowdsource physical labor. You know, find someone in the community that's closer to this police station that we can send there to, like, you know, scan this stuff for us.
Yeah, like a network and a community of people, and I'll like be your Central Florida hookup and so on. Yeah.
I've had just a similar idea, not just about FOIA, but just about archival material, and even just sometimes like a university has a copy of like somebody's files or a dissertation some guy wrote, and that like you can't get it anywhere else, but you could go to that university, and that it would be great if we could get, you know, people to volunteer to, like, if they're local to a place that has files that we need, they could go and, you know, do some actually work and contribute to the community. That's always been an idea I've had. It's just never came to fruition.
Yeah, it's a good idea. While we're speaking of Colonel Bryan, there is a special collection at Princeton University in New Jersey that has some 500 letters to him and from him in it, that is pretty much sitting there waiting for people to come read. And as we've discussed in the past, there's only so much that a library can do with a collection like that doesn't know the nuances that we know, that like we're looking for specific people he may have gotten letters from or that he wrote, that it might be really meaningful to us that it has no significance from one letter to the next of people that are not familiar with the man and his history. And even other people in the UFO community may not look at it the way I would. Like if they're looking for stuff about a UFO case, where I might be looking for stuff a certain time frame while he's in Europe or something like that. But along the lines of what you're saying, yeah, in New Jersey, there is a special collection of Joseph Bryan stuff that is, I'm sure, has been reviewed, but it's obviously not getting a lot of scans and mileage from people in the community.
So if there's anybody listening from New Jersey, get in touch with Jack here and get a scanning.
Yeah, get the scanning. All right, thanks. I just wanted to interject that. If you would continue when you'd like, please, Jeff.
Yeah, sure. So back to how we got the 8500 page 100-HQ-931126 file in our sites in the first place. It was identified by the FBI as potentially responsive to records pertaining Joseph Bryan III and in the custody of NARA. After inquiring further, NARA helpfully informed me just 2 of the pages referred directly to Bryan. NARA subsequently provided me with the 2 pages. A 1953 memo pertaining to a brainwashing movie shown during a meeting held in the Attorney General's office and attended by, among others, FBI Director Hoover and CIA Director Allen Dulles. The author of the memo, FBI Assistant Director D.M. Ladd, who had also attended the meeting, explained the film contained confessions of 4 captured American pilots who were portrayed to admit to Chinese interrogators they flew missions with the purpose of dropping bacteria. Discussion topics included techniques potentially used to solicit false confessions. Ladd noted CIA representatives indicated the agency was conducting related studies. The memo carries several implications to bacteriological warfare, the study of interrogation techniques, and the evolution of CIA mind control projects. This would prove to become somewhat of a theme of documents pertaining to Bryan and his associates, even if more an indication of the agency's obsession with the issues than that of some of its specific personnel. The memo contains one single mention of Bryan, who apparently was an associate of an involved party. Midway through the third paragraph, the film was then shown, and in sequence, the 4 American flyers were shown being questioned by Chinese Reds, and they admitted in considerable detail dates when they allegedly received briefing on bacteriological warfare and dates of missions which they allegedly flew for the purposes of dropping bacteria. After each sequence showing the questioning of one of the 4 airmen, the group was briefed in a very general, redacted, it will be redacted, was an associate of Joseph Bryan III and was questioned in connection with rumors circulated by, redacted, the group that the statements of the prisoners obviously were not correct, insomuch as a check had been made and no lectures or briefings had been given at the camps on the dates alleged by the prisoners. And several of the missions which they claimed to have flown were in fact never flown by them. It could be considered interesting that apparently no explanation about Bryan was required, seeming to suggest that those with access to the memo and perhaps in attendance at the April 1953 meeting would be familiar with him. We can only wonder what additional information might have been contained in the records on Bryan that were destroyed as indicated by the Bureau. Turning our attention back to the 37-page file of Bryan provided by the FBI, we find copies of a pair of short 1950 letters composed by Director Hoover. The first is to Judge Edward Allen Tom of the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Hoover thanked Judge Tom for forwarding a letter to him from Mr. Neil Vanderbilt. The second note from Hoover was written directly to Major Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jr., thanking him for furnishing data contained in his March 14, 1950 letter forwarded by Judge Tam. I appreciate having the information made available to me, Hoover wrote Vanderbilt. Each copy of the 2 letters from Hoover have handwritten notations, presumably added by the Bureau staff, stating, Joseph Bryan III, alias Gil Bryan. The Hoover letters were obviously placed in the file pertaining to Bryan for whatever reasons. The reference letter written by Vanderbilt and forwarded to Hoover from Tam is not in the file. A FOIA request for the document was submitted to the FBI. The Bureau responded in 2021 that potentially responsive records were identified, but not in their expected location. An additional search was conducted, but also met with unsuccessful results. The response explained. I believe Cornelius Vanderbilt Jr. to have been the son of founder of Vanderbilt University. I interpret this to be a potential further indication of Joseph Bryan's prestigious social status, among other possibilities. As previously suggested, NICAP board members and advisors were socially and professionally well connected and often financially well off. These were not only desirable characteristics for positions of leadership within UFO and nonprofit organizations, but in the case of Bryan and in his circles, traits indicative of those sought for recruitment into the CIA. It is noteworthy the Vanderbilts are documented to having been well represented in the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS was the World War II precursor to the CIA. In 1983, Athan G. Theoharis of the Marquette University Department of History published a paper titled The CIA and the New York Times, An Unanswered Question. Appearing in Government Publication Review, Volume 10, pages 257 to 259, 1983, the abstract reads, the author surveys a mysterious contact between CIA psychological warfare official Joseph Bryan III and New York Times officials in 1951, noting the need for further research into the relationship between the agency and the media and the agency and the FBI. We now know the time frame in question was right in the heart of both the escalation of the Office of Policy Coordination and future NICAP board member Bryan's apparent service to the CIA. The paper explored 2 January 1951 meetings Bryan conducted with newspaper executives. The first was in Paris with Times European Bureau Chief Cyrus Sulzberger. The second took place in New York with the uncle of Cyrus, Times publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger. Theo Harris cited a letter dated January 15, 1951, written by Cyrus to Arthur between the 2 meetings and emphasizing the importance to his uncle to clear a schedule to accommodate Bryan. I want to call this to your attention so that you are sure to see him, no matter how busy you are, Times European Bureau Chief Cyrus Sulzberger wrote. He added in his personal and confidential letter to his uncle, I am sorry to be so mysterious about this, but I want to be sure and call the subject to your attention ahead of time so that there can be no misunderstanding. The purpose of the 2 meetings are not clear. Theo Harris cited interviews later conducted with Cyrus Sulzberger and Joseph Bryan, in which the men provided conflicting accounts of the circumstances. Theo Harris described each as not fully responsive when not apparently evasive. Cyrus was quoted as suggesting Bryan had been traveling through Europe in the winter of 1951, signing up reporters for non-disclosure statements. The contracts represented agreements to provide journalists with information as long as they did not reveal the CIA as the source, Cyrus suggested. Bryan denied the allegation, suggesting Cyrus was the only newspaperman he knew in Europe. Bryan further suggested any meeting with Cyrus would have been to get information from him, not give it to him. As for the meeting with Times publisher Arthur Sulzberger in New York, Bryan claimed he could not recall the details. Oh, that Joe Bryan. So how does the Bureau fit into this part of the story, besides conducting investigations on everybody? That would be due to something the FBI called its obscene file, and Bryan's request for access to it, which was granted. Theo Harris explained in his 1983 paper. Whether or not coincidental, Bryan's approach to the New York Times European bureau chief and publisher coincided with his request initiated that same winter to secure authorization to view the FBI's obscene file, a discrete file maintained in the FBI laboratory. The obscene file had been created in 1943 and contained either derogatory personal information on diverse individuals or memorandums, letters containing obscene language. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally supervised access to this file. Outsiders were only rarely permitted to view this file, and then approval was granted for official reasons. To obtain access to the obscene file on an individual, the names or names have been deleted in released FBI documents. Bryan went through the appropriate CIA and FBI channels, secured the needed authorizations, and in May 1951 reviewed the file. He now claims that nothing came of having reviewed this file. Theo Harris aptly pointed out the saga brings up a number of relevant questions about the activities of the early 1950s CIA Psychological Warfare Division, as well as its relationships with the FBI. Also at issue was the government obstruction of answers to those questions. It did not escape my attention that Theo Harris's concerns and lines of reasoning in 1983 echoed those addressed in the previous decade by writer and researcher Stanley Bachrach, pertaining to FOIA exceptions applied to Nicholas de Rochefort and his relationship with the CIA. Before continuing this line of inquiry, it should be noted that the FBI file on Bryan contains a copy of the April 23, 1953 clipping of a social column from a New York publication. Among other society news of note, the writer explained the fabulous Aga Khan announced from Paris that a book deal was obtained. The forthcoming work would reveal the truth behind his demigod playboy facade. Sorry. According to the columnist, the aging ruler of the Ismail sect, who had apparently been in the news for half a century, was set to exact as much as $1 million from the American reading public. His contract with Simon & Schuster reportedly included the highest royalties ever paid to an author at that point in time, some 20%. The memoirs must be hot property indeed, the article stated. The Aga Khan has promised to tell everything, the writer continued. No matter how embarrassing it may be to the famous people living in dread. In fact, the memoirs deal with so many personages close to home that publishers in France and England wouldn't touch them with an asbestos glove. The article further stated the book's editor was Joseph Bryan III. He would travel with Aga Khan to 5 different European destinations, including Cannes and Venice, over the next few months to whip the material into shape. Whether significant or not, the article reminded me of Bernard J. Carvalho's 1956 publicity tour with Meher Baba, among other implications. I interpret researcher Theo Harris may have suspected the combined circumstances suggest Bryan was in the business of obtaining dirt on potential communists or others in order to provide political leverage. Motives may have included inspiring persons of interest to defect from the Soviet Union. A similar April 1953 article was published in the Washington, D.C. Evening Star. It stated Aga Khan, the spiritual head of 80 million Ismail Muslims, decided to write his memoirs and reached all the way to Washington to get the man who would do it for him. The article identified ghostwriter Bryan as the former assistant to the Secretary of the Air Force and a New York socialite. Bryan moved to D.C. with his wife, the piece stated, a few years ago when he joined the Central Intelligence Agency.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate you reading. Thank you.
Sure.
Something that it kind of bothers me a little. It still does. It's hard to like not want to be overly conspiratorial, yet at the same time, I felt like you really can't get around that this stuff between the bacteriological warfare angle and the Europe and the press angle and the people he's involved with, Joseph Bryan, it just keeps knocking on the door of behavior modification and MKULTRA, and it's all around it. Same with, of course, Hillenkoetter was the head of the CIA, and it's just interesting how a historic look at it, like a look back at it, it always seems to kind of be like people are willing to say, yeah, the behavior modification projects were terrible, but it wasn't whoever we're talking about right here, right now. And it pretty much necessarily involved the director of the CIA. You know, let's start with that. Then we have a psychological warfare expert who's coordinating European projects and press coverage, apparently. And we're going to discover in the coming sections some of his associates and what they were doing in Europe. And there's not a link to MKUltra, yet there's certainly not a separation either, you know. Now, what does that mean for people interested in saucers? What does it mean when the same people that are one person removed from projects that violated human rights, that did unethical, if not illegal, experimentation, are UFO flag wavers? What does that mean for people interested in it, and what does it mean for the topic?
You make the same statement now, considering Luis Elizondo, one of the current heads, apparently was involved with torture and whatnot back in the day. Again, a lot of people apparently don't seem to care, as long as, you know, that these people are saying the kind of UFO stuff that they want to hear. It doesn't matter so much all the other shady stuff that they've been involved with.
Interesting point. Any thoughts, Brian?
I mean, the saucer interest is a tripwire for the counterintelligence groups, right? It's we've called it a petri dish. It's a conduit, right? It's an easy way to amplify their expertise. If you want, like you said, we have to be objective, but it's so hard not to just like see these two things next to each other, be like counterintelligence network of folks who are malleable and not draw that conclusion. So I try not to, because you're right. Like you made the point earlier, we have to be objective. We have to see what we see, but like, man, what is happening? It's very strange.
Yeah, thank you. I've argued in some blog posts as well that the UFO topic kind of launders the legacy of some of these guys too. For what the average person, especially the average person in UFO circles, thinks about or knows about Roscoe Hillenkoetter, I think would almost be a hody-ho, jolly old guy that said really cool things about we need to investigate these saucers, because on social media, you see these little meme plaques with quotes from Hillenkoetter, and I think that's what they know about Hillenkoetter. I think there is a significant and interesting contrast if you read the work of Dr. Jeffrey Kay and people who do deep dives on Bluebird, Artichoke, and how it led to MKUltra, about how their legacy and their public opinion was kind of laundered and whitewashed by being a friend to the UFO community. I don't know if that was intentional, because I don't know how relevant it was in the 1960s and the 1970s, but in 2026, it's a pretty good disinfectant to be a UFO flag waver that just happened to have signed the green light on Operation Bluebird.
Jackie, I was going to add one more thing too.
Sure.
About Brian's involvement with press too. And I'm making these connections, and this is for discussion. There always is like this expertise that Kehoe had with PR, Brian with a writer. You have whistleblowers now who have books, like the megaphone that they have to. It's just really interesting that there's not a person with an interesting story. I'm not saying all of them, but someone who's notable, who's made fame, it has the megaphone and the ability to do that. I'm not really sure what my thought is here, but it just seems to be a commonality behind. They're really good at hype or controlling a message or getting it out with a book, with a this and that. And that's just really interesting, the similarities, I suppose. Really a half-baked thought, but I wondered what you guys thought about it.
I think that's relevant. And I also think that in the case of the 1950s and the 1960s, I don't think the public was the target as much as adversarial intelligence analysts that would be reading the newspaper, and other populations that would be reading the newspaper. And I think sometimes the American public was considered collateral damage. How does that apply now? in my opinion, when the spokespersons for the Department of Defense weighed their words heavily after the 2017 New York Times piece, they didn't want to say anything specifically about Luis Elizondo. They had a prepared statement that he worked in this office, he didn't work in that office, he had no responsibilities in this project, and that was it. And if you followed that up with a question like, so you're saying this, you're saying that, all they do is give you that prepared statement again. I don't know what that means, but it's not, I think you can reasonably conclude that they see some of the confusion as advantageous. They don't want to clarify things. They don't want to throw anybody under the bus. They don't want to perpetuate certain things Elizondo was saying and alleged whistleblowers are saying, but they're not clarifying. Are we still collateral damage? I think so, to some extent. That the DOD spokesperson had a prepared statement. They gave it to me and other writers. They had nothing more, nothing less to say. And it's my responsibility to be a critical thinker and not read too much or too little into it. Seemed to be their position, that their objective is to not make sure I don't get confused, you know.
I'm not sure that the current crop of people are particularly well trained at, selling a narrative. I think the people they hooked up with are. So, like, if you're like, the UFO topic is always thirsty for a credentialed government insider that'll tell them, what they want to hear. And so it's kind of a good after, military, post-military career to kind of have, I guess, in the UFO topic. And I think the people that they've hooked up with, like these foundations that have, like TTSA, for example, that had paid PR people, knew how to push a message. I mean, like, if you actually watch, like, it wasn't until Luis Elizondo's book came out that he clearly actually went through media training on how to talk to the media. And he actually got to be a bit better of a speaker when communicating on television shows. But he wasn't initially, like that. And so I don't think it's like, whereas in the past we had these guys that was like their whole life, like Brian, for example, like doing media and PR and writing and journalism and all that kind of stuff. I don't think that's the case with a lot of the newer guys. They've just hooked up with people that have PR teams. Like that meeting they just had a week or two or whenever it was ago in Washington, D.C., a large amount of the people at that meeting were the PR group 42 West that were there as wranglers, like handling the situation. So they have people for it these days. They don't need to actually have the skills themselves.
Interesting input. Yeah.
And so, Jack, you were saying this makes sense now. So the means in which we had Brian as a writer is because the audience was the Americans, but also international interest too, as a means to saying, like, this is what we're talking about, and that's how Russia or the USSR got intel, was from our newspapers. So you're saying the collateral damage there was sometimes we got some funny stuff to kind of throw off everyone else. That's a big difference, and that makes a lot of sense. Yeah,
I think so. And newspapers were so much more important then. Even in my lifetime, there was a time that I'd look forward to the daily newspaper to get the latest on what was going on in Libya, and or at least the latest statements from the presidential spokesperson and the Pentagon. And you got it once a day. and you'd spend 24 hours reading about it, and then you'd get it again tomorrow. And yeah, I think those were very valuable tools to intelligence analysts. Other tools would include like intercepting diplomatic messages, like couriers coming and going from embassies, intercepting it, trying to decode it. But the newspaper's just right there and free, and I think that's why we were seeing the American embassy in Moscow sending the State Department stateside the published article by the Russian scientists about calling UFOs nonsense. That like, you guys need to know this was in the paper in Moscow and this is being incorporated into their position and public consciousness, was my interpretation of the whole point of the memo. I think newspapers were a big deal. I think like internet today, I think like Jeff's saying, the people that have agents, publicity agents, public relations personnel. I think that's kind of what I think Joseph Bryan was for the CIA to some extent. And he knew how to carry himself. He was articulate. He could, as we've talked about, transition from one social circumstance and nationality to another pretty gracefully. I also think he was looking for dirt. I think that's one of the reasons that he would have interviewed Aga Khan in depth. I think it's why he would do these tell-all books. I think it's why he would interview some of the international people he did. I think he was looking and his interest in the FBI obscene file to know what the FBI knew. Did it correspond with what information he was getting? I suspect may have been at issue. And that these were ways of compromising Russian agents and enemies and seeing if CIA officers were compromised. I think he had a lot of reasons that the agency would have been interested in for writing biographies and memoirs and things like that for people.
Yeah, I mean, it's good cover, right? Like, this whole time he's working with the CIA, he's writing articles for all these like mainstream like magazines and like publications on all these people. So instead of like going to somebody, hey, I'm a CIA officer, I want to find out this information from you, you're like, oh no, I'm gonna write an article for you for this magazine, which I do legitimately work for. You don't even have to tell them you're a CIA officer.
Yeah, like I even wonder, like the conversation kind of comes back to the interaction with Hoover. He may have accomplished what he went to the FBI headquarters for under the guise of, I'll write an article about. Yeah, I mean, he may have pulled on Hoover and the Bureau the same things he was doing to other targets in the field, for all I know. He may not have, but yeah, I mean, he got his sit down with Hoover. And while Hoover's so confident that he's interrogating Bryan, don't be so sure a little bit of the other way around it and take place too. Right. It's great, though.
Building his own obscene file.
Yeah. We pick up the trail of Joseph Bryan and the FBI obscene file back in the PDF compiled on Bryan by the Bureau. The implications are complex and not entirely clear, as contained in some 1955 letters and memos. It is completely clear, however, the cast of characters were very much involved in issues surrounding communist China, the hunt for communist sympathizers, and the related accusations potentially used as intelligence tools, whether true or not. It is noteworthy Nicholas de Roquefort's apparent areas of interest, Red China and psychological warfare, were very much at issue, as were agencies such as the State Department, which repeatedly surfaced in our saga of NICAP and its personnel. It additionally seems worth keeping in mind that Office of Policy Coordination activities in the early 1950s included Project BG Marquis, an operation consisting of commando raids against China's mainland coast. Other CIA operations targeting China during the same time frame include the curiously titled H.T. Merlin, which sought to create the perception nationalist China discredited itself in the eyes of its population. Related materials suggest such initiatives came to include U-2 reconnaissance missions. I find it likely the involvement of Roquefort and his associates, as explored earlier, in the 1956 NICAP scheme may have been an extension of the themes of the 1950s intelligence community. Plot lines represented in the Bureau file pertaining to Bryan include copies of letters provided to the FBI by J.G. J. Sauerwein. He served as chief counsel for many years on Senate committees that conducted inquiries into such topics as lack of security in the State Department, communist activities in the United States, and operations considered harmful to American interests undertaken with media outlets. The New York Times was particularly called into question, while some accused Senate committees of unjustly targeting the newspaper. In June 1955, Sauerwein gave the FBI copies of 2 letters exchanged between Bryan and Captain Robert A. Winston, U.S. Navy retired. The letters are contained in the Bryan file. They indicate strong disagreements between Bryan and Winston over testimony Winston provided to a Senate committee during a closed-door hearing to which Sauerwein had access. Accusations of derogatory comments were thrown about, including questions of scurrilous statements allegedly made by Bryan about Director Hoover himself. Bryan and Winston, both Navy men, apparently knew one another a significant amount of time, as Bryan wrote to Winston he thought he was still his friend. In a response to Bryan, Winston referenced a Lyle Munson, who worked with us in the CIA and whom you personally had recommended to me as a thoroughly reliable and patriotic individual with enough guts to testify before the same group I went to. Winston suggested Bryan's name did not come up during a telephone conversation with Munson, who apparently told him he could put complete trust in J. Sauerwein, counsel for the committee. Sauerwein was subsequently briefed by Winston, who again suggested to Bryan his name did not come up, and the counselor immediately arranged for Winston to testify under oath in an executive section. Before and after my testimony, I stressed its sensitivity and the danger to our country should it be revealed, Winston explained further in his letter to Bryan. I now urge you to keep this matter from public knowledge for the same reasons. Winston informed Bryan specifically about his testimony. I did state that you had made certain statements to me in private, in your office, in the course of explaining to me why you personally could not visit the FBI obscenity room and why you wanted the FBI's permission for our two staff artists to go there. The letters indicate the Office of Naval Intelligence was asking around about Winston, presumably conducting an investigation. It at least partially pertained to communist sympathizing, distribution of propaganda, moral conduct, and similar issues. A resulting 1955 FBI memo, subject Joseph Bryan III, authored by Assistant Director Nichols, indicates he discussed the circumstances with Senator Jenner, a player in the saga. Nichols paraphrased the senator as stating he never had any doubt in his mind, but that Winston told the truth. He furthermore never had any doubt in his mind, wrote Nichols, but that Bryan was a liar as he had tangled with Bryan before. Nichols documented explaining to Senator Jenner that Bryan denied making the statement in question, whatever exactly it may have been, adding that Bryan provided a handwritten letter to Hoover reiterating the denial. It was made clear to the senator the Bureau wanted him to know this because it did not like having malicious lies circulate. The overt representation of the significance of communism, Red China, and related social dynamics of the intelligence community, observable among these men as the incorporation of NICAP loomed closer, could be considered interesting. That and Robert A. Winston had a specific history in UFO lore, even if the UFO community did not know it. Winston composed some of the most comprehensive intelligence reports on the ghost rockets of the 1940s and figured prominently in James Carrion's nonfiction book, Anachronism. The book explores the likelihood the UFO topic served intelligence interests as a tool of deception during the 1946-47 timeframe. Carrion cited documents establishing Winston as the U.S. naval attaché at Stockholm, Sweden during 1946. At which time Winston observed the brass was quite unconcerned about the reported rocket sightings. Swedish press and public aroused, Winston documented in a formerly top secret 1946 intelligence report. But Swedish Air Force officers still on summer leave, aircraft warning net not mobilized, and no attempts made to intercept missiles with jet fighters. Winston continued that the Swedish defense staff obviously wished he and others to believe the objects were rockets, but he was clearly unconvinced a threat was genuinely perceived. He concluded the Swedes knew the origin of the missiles and were not worried about them. Moreover, Winston added, the Swedish defense staff will conceal any evidence of the true nature of the reported objects until it deems expedient to release the information. Carrion proposed there were a limited number of American officials in on the ghost rocket ruse along with their Swedish counterparts. He just didn't think Winston was in the loop at the time. Winston's future career in the CIA seems to have possibly increased his information access. And here is another part of that. report that he wrote in 1946. Bureau files obtained on Robert A. Winston contain memos from 1960 indicating he went on to write a fiction novel, The Pentagon Case, under the name Colonel Victor J. Fox. The book pertains to DC politics and the communist threat, particularly, as I understand it, a heroic Pentagon official fighting for democracy amid persecution and mounting odds. As of this writing, I am not aware if Captain Winston wrote in an official capacity for his CIA employer. Given the time frame of his work as a naval attaché in 1946, I would not find it surprising to discover his recruitment into the agency corresponded in some way with the launching of the Office of Policy Coordination in 1948 and its subsequent escalation. A 1962 newspaper clipping archived on the CIA website identified Winston as a former staff member of the agency and the author of 7 books. The article was an announcement for a speaking engagement for Winston. He was described as a controversial figure who had been the subject of attacks from communist publications, left-wing columnists, and unnamed Pentagon spokesman, the latter specifically put in quotes. The reasons for the attacks were attributed to his writings. Continuing our exploration of the 37-page PDF on Bryan provided by the FBI, there is a 4-page 1953 memo on Louis Pinky Steenrod Thompson, Jr. I found the inclusion of the memo in the file intriguing because it contains no mention whatsoever of Bryan, only the handwritten addition of his name beneath the subject line. The notation was presumably added for filing purposes at some point after the document was read by the recipient, Assistant Director Nichols. The top of page 1 of the memo as pictured on screen. The basis of the memo was stated to be a summary of pertinent information in Bureau files regarding Thompson and in accordance with the instructions of Nichols. Surmising Nichols requested the summary and Thompson's activities somehow related to Bryan, I began searching for further information about Thompson. Having read quite a bit about Bryan by this point in my research, it did not escape my attention Thompson was a Princeton alumnus, as was Bryan. The time period matched as well. An initial search of CIA records resulted in several returns on Thompson. They included such items as a reference to Thompson in an entry on page 79 of the 1950 calendar of DCI Walter Bedell Smith. I discovered an intriguing passage in author Hugh Wilford's 2013 book, The CIA, the British Left, and the Cold War. Page 229 describes the likelihood an organization called the American Committee on United Europe was in fact a front for the Office of Policy Coordination and, in essence, the CIA and State Department. According to the recollection of one source, Wilford explained, an initial payment funneled through related channels, quote, arrived in the form of a bag containing $75,000 dumped on his desk by CIA officer Pinky Thompson with the words, "This is for you," end quote. Also, that item from the calendar on screen, C.D. Jackson is well known in UFO circles and conspiracy circles as a asset and operative, and that NCFE is a committee for a free Europe. I think it's National Committee, something like that, for a free Europe. Thus, some of the more significance of what the author Wilford writes in his book. Wilford goes on to explain the operation became more sophisticated and described the scale of funding as massive. Only about a third of the total disbursements were recorded on the ACUE's books. Wilford continued, adding payments were disguised as gifts from fictitious donors or company-sponsored foundations and trusts. The remaining two-thirds were described as being transacted covertly. Wilford explained his research suggested the CIA was passing nearly $1 million a year via the ACUE to the European Unity Campaign in the mid-1950s. Another file located at the CIA website documented minutes of a 1952 meeting that included such notables as DCI General Smith, Frank Wisner, and Allen Dulles. Others in attendance included Deputy Director for Administration Walter Reed Wolf, who stated Pinky Thompson would be coming to work initially as a special assistant. It seemed increasingly likely the FBI memo pertaining to Pinky Thompson was placed in the file compiled on Joseph Bryan due to something to do with such circumstances as their positions with the Office of Policy Coordination and CIA. It was during this phase of my research in 2019 I first discovered the previously referenced book written by E. Howard Hunt and Greg Onapu, American Spy, My Secret History in the CIA. The following entry, located on page 46, would become a primary factor in what led me to learn more about NICAP, the OPC, and eventually Counsel Services Mary Von King and her associates. And I will read that E. Howard Hunt wrote, at headquarters among the government buildings astride Washington, D.C.'s reflecting pool, OPC established 3 subdivisions: paramilitary operations, political and psychological warfare, and economic warfare. I was assigned to the political and psychological warfare staff headed by Joseph Bryan III, a Navy veteran and a writer. Besides me, Bryan gathered an interestingly eclectic staff, including writer Finis Farr, Philadelphia investment banker Gates Lloyd, Louis Pinky Thompson, a New York and New Jersey financier, and Carlton Alsop, a former movie producer and Hollywood agent. All except Alsop and myself were Princeton alumni. The staff was soon joined by artist illustrator Hugh Troy, who then formed another small coterie of political cartoonists and polemicists who would generate a large amount of material that found its way into newspapers around the world. Learning more about the activities of the men who worked for Bryan in the OPC does not necessarily tell us more about NICAP. It does, however, provide us a better profile of Bryan, the work he did, the circles he kept, and the interests of an agency, the CIA, which employed numerous people associated with NICAP. No less than 7 such people, and Nicholas de Roquefort, Bernard J.O. Carvalho, Roscoe Hillencoter, Joseph Bryan, Alan Hall, Harry Cooper, and Charles Lombard, and I should also add General Wiedemeyer to that, were verified or strongly implicated as CIA personnel or associates. Most filled positions of leadership in NICAP, spanning from its inception to dissolution. You will note Hunt's awareness above of Bryan's apparent partiality to employing Princeton alumni. It was a little before Bryan and Thompson's days at the university, but Dulles was a Princeton man himself. And that ends chapter 11. And in the next chapter, we will explore the activities of some of these people in Joseph Bryan's crew and see how that might give us some more puzzle pieces or background. Any thoughts or comments, guys?
Just going to mention it. It had completely slipped my mind, I guess, how Joseph Bryan's son is C.D. Bryan, the guy who wrote the book on the MIT abduction conference in the 1990s. Like, for some reason, I either forgot that or it just slipped my mind or I didn't put it together. But when I was reading through, I think it might even be the next chapter you mentioned, C.D. Bryan, but I thought that was interesting. So even his son got into the UFO game after he did.
Yeah, he did. And it's my interpretation that his son holds the position that Dad was interested in UFOs and I'm interested in UFOs, and UFOs are extraterrestrial, and nothing strange about him being involved with NICAP because he was interested in UFOs. I think it is my interpretation of his son's position. Yeah.
I'll just say the irony of Kehoe bringing on his handler. That's just the weirdest part, is like all these guys are either buddies or they're part of the agency. I don't know. I say kind of the same comment every time, but like each demonstration of it over and over and over again. But he literally invited in his handler. Like, that is crazy.
Yeah, I can really appreciate your comments from time to time and week to week. I think that you have an appreciation of, I was just kind of looking into this stuff because it's kind of my bag of where does the intelligence community and the UFO community overlap. And I increasingly was hit with stuff that I was like, this is just absurd. That, like, this is so, like, while there's no smoking gun of intelligence community tampering in the UFO community, there doesn't need to be one because they just took it up. They just were the UFO, like the whole thing is just a CIA production, you know? And then people like Richard Hall will argue, well, no, they never bothered me. Well, obviously you were doing stuff that they were cool with you doing. I mean, like, what do you mean they didn't meddle? That means they enabled what you were doing, is my perspective of the situation. But yeah, I can appreciate that just time and time again, when I get a FOIA response from the FBI and I would further link, like for a long time, that Lewis Thompson, Pinky Thompson thing just sat there because out of 37 pages, one that I didn't know what it was about can incorrectly seem like it's not very important. And since that, I've come to look at it more that maybe the one that I don't know what it means is the one that is important, is why I don't know what it means. And finally, I thought I really need to find out who this guy was rather than just keep shrugging and going, I don't know. There's enough other material in here to write about, to not worry about one page out of 37. And yeah, I mean, turns out I think they put Pinky in the Bryan file because he was a Bryan asset, you know? And like you say, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Kehoe brought aboard his handler. Yeah. Yet there's still an interesting social dynamic going on here of Kehoe goes all the way back to the early kitchen table days at Townsend Brown's house, you know, that like he and Townsend Brown and Morris Jessup, you know, they're sitting around, they're trying to figure out what to do about saucers. It's interesting, like somewhere in there, there are some coincidences. There are some people sincerely interested in saucers, and it becomes difficult to tell who just started turning a blind eye, who sincerely couldn't figure out the CIA's all over this. I think a lot of times people are willing to dance with intelligence officers a la Bill Moore because they think they're going to get in further. They think it's going to be advantageous. I don't know, but yeah, again and again, Brian, I would open a FOIA release and look at it, and I'd just be like, this is just ridiculous, man. It's just ridiculous what these people were doing. To the extent I got a little resentful that NICAP continues to be presented as a legitimate grassroots UFO organization, when I often had the feeling that historians and researchers knew what I was reading and either rationalized it wasn't important or were consciously aware this does not further my argument for the importance of UFOs as an alien presence and didn't want to explore this material, or just really like the angle of let's make Kehoe and Hall heroes, and we're just not going with any messy intelligence stuff. Kind of like how people sometimes want to keep politics out of stuff, but you really can't. Like it's the underlying foundation of why there's a CIA, you know, like all of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you still of the opinion that Kehoe was just a victim of the UFO blinders? Is that a fair summary, or is he too complex to kind of simplify it? Because to my comment about him accepting folks in that he probably shouldn't or have had more discernment, was that just his lack of was just his extreme focus on what he believed was true, or is that just too simplistic?
I haven't decided. I don't know. The jury's out on whether he was a willing asset, whether he was a knowing asset, whether he was oblivious and just thought he could get a book deal if he kept jumping on this topic, all of the above at different times. I think it's a reasonable question, and we've talked about before, conspiracies fester when it's difficult to accept someone's as stupid as they're pretending to be, you know. As unflattering as that is, I don't think I think it reasonably fits the circumstance. What do you think about that, Jeff? Kehoe, what was his deal?
I don't know. I think he probably, like a lot of people nowadays, I think he probably had multiple motives and interests. Like, I think he was probably a bit of a true believer as well. I think he probably thought there was something there. But he also might have other interests, you know, other benefits he gained from being the topic, financial or otherwise, or just, you know, notoriety and status. You know, that's the thing. A lot of people like, well, they're not getting rich. Like, well, there's more to gain than just like hard cash. Like, there's a lot of different kind of currency you can be paid in, you know, and one of those is just, you know, status and notoriety and connections you make and stuff like that, that might be beneficial to you. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what's going on in people's heads. You know, we're not them, but I think it's probably, you know, I think he's probably fairly sincere in his belief as far as some of this stuff goes. But he might have had other motives as well.
Something that I don't necessarily think it matters a lot, but I think that it doesn't get enough discussion is his political motivations. It's pretty well known he was a tour manager for Lindbergh, and Lindbergh was an outspoken German sympathizer. He was involved in what many consider to be a fascist rally at Madison Square Garden. He was a spokesperson for that organization. Some of the first FBI concerns about Kehoe was that he wrote an article published in a widely distributed magazine that accused the FBI of having knowledge of a Hitler plot to overtake the merchant marines. This was pre-World War II. And the FBI memo on this intelligence says that Kehoe's accusation was entirely unwarranted and fabricated. So I think it deserves more discussion when a guy like that ends up actively trying to weaken the security structure of intelligence agencies. How much that mattered, I don't know. How much he may have been handled by others that were treating him in a manner that effectively got him to do what they wanted him to do. I don't know. But I think there's a lot of conversations to be had about what reasons people around him may have had for motivating his actions, in addition to discovering who was piloting alleged UFOs. Yeah.
Yeah, I certainly think that just like today, some of these people are potentially being used as useful idiots by the intelligence community for whatever reason that may be. You know, they don't even have to be active, knowledgeable participants in the game. They just are manipulated in a way, that takes advantage of their gullibility or naivete.
In a manner of speaking, the less they're aware of the game, the better it might be for the handler. Yeah, that and there's a lot of stuff like that. And I think it appears for all the world that it's pretty much been that way since 1940s, Now, there may be unexplained phenomena that we will know more about one day, like legitimate UFO reports that deserve scrutiny. And the fact remains what we're talking about here still applies. Well, thank you very much for joining me, and thanks for joining at home. Please visit us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org to learn more about what we do and ways you can get involved. If you feel like you may be a good fit for the book group, please reach out to jackbrewerblog@yahoo.com. You will find that email address and more links and resources in the YouTube video description. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time on the Wayward Sons Book Group.